The day the German Navy rebelled. Operation Rainbow. April 1945. Europe was a continent in ruin. The Third Reich, once the embodiment of power and military precision, was now a shadow of itself. Cities lay in smoldering heaps, factories were silent or destroyed, and the streets echoed with the sounds of retreating soldiers and advancing Allied boots. Amid this chaos, a decision was being made that could have changed the fate of the German Navy forever. At the heart of this storm sat Admiral Karl Dönitz, the newly appointed Führer after Hitler's death. Dönitz, a man of cold calculation and unwavering loyalty to the Reich, faced a dilemma. The Allies were closing in on every front, and the once feared U-boat fleet, Germany's underwater terror that had hunted the Atlantic convoys for years, was now vulnerable. Entire bases lay exposed, fleets were stranded, and surrender seemed inevitable. But Dönitz was a man of principle and obsession. He could not allow the U-boats, the pride of the Kriegsmarine, to fall into enemy hands. His orders were clear: scuttle the entire U-boat fleet before the Allies could seize them. The plan, codenamed Operation Regenbogen, Rainbow, was simple in theory, but nightmarish in execution. Every submarine, every piece of equipment, every secret document was to be destroyed. Nothing would remain. By early May, tensions reached a breaking point. In Kiel, Wilhelmshaven, and Hamburg, U-boat captains began questioning the orders. Some considered openly defying them. Rumors of secret negotiations with the Allies spread through the ranks. Surrender could save lives, preserve what little dignity remained, and prevent unnecessary death. On May 4, 1945, Operation Rainbow was set into motion. Orders crackled over radio waves dictating precise methods of destruction. Open the seacocks, flood the compartments, ignite the charges, ensure the U-boat sinks to the bottom and is lost forever. Everywhere, the Kriegsmarine braced for one of the largest self-destruction operations in history. And then it happened. Something Dönitz did not anticipate. Rebellion from within. At Kiel, one of the largest U-boat bases in Germany, crews refused to carry out the orders. They cut lines, ignored signals, and even sabotaged the scuttling mechanisms meant to destroy the submarines. Captains argued that surrendering to the Allies, though humiliating, was far better than senselessly sinking vessels that had been their home for years. Word spread like wildfire. From Wilhelmshaven to Hamburg, the tide was turning. Officers who had once obeyed blindly were now defying direct commands from the highest authority. Dönitz, informed of the disobedience, grew furious. Yet even he understood the fragile state of his navy. To enforce the order would have required mass executions, a step he was unwilling or perhaps unable to take. The rebellion was not violent, it was quiet, calculated, and disciplined. The crews chose life over blind loyalty, choosing surrender over self-destruction. By May 5th, the scuttling operations were largely abandoned. Ships that were meant to be destroyed were instead handed over to Allied forces, often intact. The U-boats that had terrorized the Atlantic for years now surrendered quietly in harbors across northern Germany. Operation Rainbow, designed to erase the Kriegsmarine's legacy, had failed, not through enemy intervention, but through the moral courage of the men who served it.
The aftermath was surreal. Dönitz's last gamble had collapsed, and the war in Europe ended days later, on May 8, 1945, with the German surrender. The U-boat fleet, once a symbol of fear and efficiency, had survived, a testament to the quiet rebellion that had chosen survival over destruction. Some of these submarines would later serve under Allied flags, studied and repurposed, turning instruments of war into lessons of history. But the story of Operation Rainbow is not just about ships and strategy. It is a story of conscience amid obedience, of men who dared to defy orders when the cost of loyalty was too high, and of the fleeting line between honor and futility. In the end, the rebellion saved lives, preserved history, and demonstrated that even in the darkest days of war, humanity could triumph over blind obedience. The calm before the storm. As April 1945 drew to a close, Germany was a nation gasping its last breaths. From the bombed-out streets of Berlin to the shattered industrial heartlands along the Ruhr, chaos reigned. Trains no longer ran reliably, bridges were rubble, and communication lines flickered with sporadic radio signals. Yet amidst the ruin, the Kriegsmarine, Germany's navy, remained a peculiar bastion of discipline and organization. At Flensburg-Mervik, the seat of the Kriegsmarine's high command, after Berlin fell, Admiral Dönitz pored over maps, reports, and radio transcripts. His eyes, sharp and calculating, moved from one column of U-boat locations to another. Each symbol on the map represented not just a vessel, but the lives of men who had risked everything beneath the Atlantic waves. He had a decision to make, and he believed it was a decisive one. No U-boat was to fall into Allied hands.
The order, drafted under the codename Operation Regenbogen, Rainbow, was precise, almost ritualistic. It specified, all U-boats stationed in German ports were to be scuttled immediately. Any submarine at sea or unable to return safely must follow strict procedures to ensure total destruction. Secret documents, technical manuals, encryption keys, and any experimental technology were to be obliterated. Crews were to be evacuated if possible, but the primary mission was total denial of assets to the Allies. These were not just military orders. They were, in Dönitz's mind, the last act of loyalty to the Reich, a final statement of honor in a world collapsing around them. Messages crackled across the network. At Kiel, one of the largest submarine bases in the world, the order arrived in the form of encrypted radio signals, then in written dispatches handed personally to base commanders. Officers read the instructions in silence. For years, these men had trained, drilled, and endured under the strictest military discipline. They had hunted convoys in the stormy Atlantic, survived depth charges that tore through steel hulls, and returned home to tell the tale. Yet now their very survival was being pitted against an order that demanded destruction. Captain Heinz Wilhelm Eck, commander of U-3511, sat alone in his office, staring at the scrawled orders. His men waited outside, unaware of the storm about to engulf them. Eck had spent years under the command of Dönitz, respecting his authority, but now doubt gnawed at him. To scuttle his own submarine, to sink a vessel he had called home, felt not like an act of honor, but a senseless waste. He thought of his crew, young men who had survived near impossible missions, and the families they would never return to if the U-boat sank with them or they were caught in the chaos. Across the harbor, Wilhelmshaven hummed with activity. Crews moved through the docks, carrying supplies, inspecting torpedoes, and checking engines. Under the fluorescent lights of the naval yards, tension coiled like a spring. Whispers circulated. Did you see the orders? They want everything gone, every ship, every document. Some officers nodded grimly. Others shook their heads in disbelief. The question lingered in every mind. Do we obey or do we survive? By early May, the first attempts at scuttling had begun, but resistance had already taken root. In Kiel, sailors quietly disabled demolition charges, altered timers, and even misreported the status of their vessels. No open rebellion had erupted yet. It was a quiet, invisible defiance, but it was enough to frustrate the high command. Every message sent by Dönitz was met with delays, confusion, or deliberate misinterpretation. The seeds of rebellion were planted. Meanwhile, at sea, several U-boats were ordered to return to harbor for scuttling.
Captain Friedrich Long of U-987 transmitted back a chilling but defiant message. "We have survived the Atlantic, survived the Allies, and will not sink under orders that serve only the dead." His words spread quickly through the naval radio network, a spark of morale and rebellion. For the first time, officers began to question openly whether obedience was truly honorable or simply blind submission to a lost cause. The tension reached its peak on May 4, 1945. The day was calm, almost eerily so, as if the Baltic Sea itself held its breath. Across Kiel, Wilhelmshaven, and Hamburg, crews prepared for Operation Rainbow, unaware that the very order meant to ensure total destruction would be undermined by the quiet courage of the men they commanded. That day, history would pivot, not on the fire of battle, but on the moral choices of men who refused to sink their own legacy.
The rebellion begins. May 4th, 1945. The morning sun rose over the Baltic, casting pale light on the naval harbors of northern Germany. At first glance, life at Kiel and Wilhelmshaven seemed normal. Sailors cleaned decks, officers reviewed logs, and the hum of diesel engines filled the air. But beneath the surface, tension throbbed like a coiled spring. Every man aboard every U-boat knew that the day would mark a pivotal choice: obey orders to destroy their own ships, or defy the Reich and survive. At Kiel, the first attempts to scuttle began in the early hours. Charges were armed, compartments flooded, and timers set. Yet almost immediately, confusion erupted. Crewmen discovered that demolition circuits had been deliberately sabotaged. In one instance, the crew of U-3014, tasked with sinking in the harbor, reported multiple failures. Fuses misfired, water valves jammed, and torpedo hatches remained stubbornly sealed. Captain Otto Fiedler, a man known for his iron discipline, realized what had happened. He confronted his senior officers. "Who did this?" he demanded, his voice low but furious. No one answered. Instead, eyes shifted, hands fidgeted, and a heavy silence filled the room. Fiedler understood. His crew had chosen to defy the order, not out of malice, but out of conscience. He had a choice himself: to punish them, enforce obedience, or yield to the quiet mutiny. He paused, sensing the moral weight of the moment. In the end, he nodded almost imperceptibly, signaling that the scuttling would not proceed. The rebellion had claimed its first victory. At Hamburg, the rebellion took a more organized form. Senior officers called clandestine meetings with their crews, debating strategy and the risks of disobedience. One officer, Lieutenant Klaus Richter, argued passionately, "We are not betraying Germany, we are preserving the lives of our men and ensuring that these ships do not die senselessly. That is honor, that is duty." His words resonated, and crews across the city resolved to resist the scuttling orders quietly, but firmly. Meanwhile, Admiral Dönitz monitored events from Flensburg. Reports poured in, failed scuttling attempts, delayed operations, and whispered defiance. He could feel the grip on his fleet slipping. Yet, he faced a dilemma. To enforce obedience with force would require executing men who had survived the Atlantic, men whose skill and courage had been the backbone of Germany's naval power. In a fleet already exhausted, broken, and facing inevitable surrender, such actions could lead to chaos, even open mutiny. Dönitz hesitated. At sea, the rebellion was no less dramatic. Several U-boats, returning to port under orders to be destroyed, chose instead to surface and signal surrender to nearby Allied ships. Captain Friedrich Lang of U-987, navigating the icy waters of the North Sea, made contact with a British destroyer, transmitting, "We surrender, no harm will come to our men. The U-boat is intact." Allied officers were stunned. The submarine that had once stalked Atlantic convoys was now offering itself peacefully, a symbol of the moral choices shaping the final days of the war. By midday, it was clear that Operation Rainbow was unraveling.
The Kriegsmarine's last act of loyalty, scuttling the U-boat fleet, had been subverted by the very men it relied upon. In ports across northern Germany, officers aced a silent revolution. The rebellion was not violent, but its implications were profound. The U-boat fleet, the pride of the Reich, would survive, not through strategy or combat, but through conscience and courage. As the sun set over Kiel, the harbor waters were calm. Ships floated where they should have sunk. U-boats that were meant to vanish into the Baltic depths remained intact, creaking softly in the evening breeze. The rebellion had succeeded, not with gunfire, but with quiet defiance, moral courage, and the refusal to obey an order that demanded destruction without purpose.
That night, men across the Kriegsmarine reflected on their choices. Some feared retribution. Others felt relief, a rare sense of agency after years of blind obedience. In quiet cabins and bunkers, they recorded logs, prepared surrender papers, and waited the inevitable arrival of Allied forces. What they had done was extraordinary, not a battle of arms, but a battle of conscience, shaping the course of history in subtle, irreversible ways.
At Hamburg, the scale of the surrender was even more dramatic. Hundreds of sailors, officers, and support personnel lined the docks, waving flags of surrender. Senior officers walked calmly to meet the Allied representatives, carrying personal logbooks and technical papers, ensuring no information was lost to chaos. Lieutenant Klaus Richter, who had inspired rebellion, personally oversaw the handover of U-boats and equipment, ensuring that both men and vessels would survive intact. At sea, several U-boats made contact with Allied fleets independently. Captain Friedrich Lang of U-987 navigated through a narrow channel to meet British destroyers patrolling the North Sea. As the submarine surfaced, a tense silence fell. Lang's crew, hardened by years of depth charges and Atlantic storms, now faced their final test. Slowly, carefully, they followed surrender protocols, climbing out of the vessel and waving white flags. The Allied sailors, once enemies, now witnessed a display of discipline and humanity. Meanwhile, back at Flensburg, Admiral Dönitz observed the surrender unfold with a complex mix of frustration, relief, and resignation. His plan to scuttle the U-boat fleet had failed, yet he could not punish the men without risking further chaos. The Kriegsmarine's pride had survived, not through obedience, but through the moral courage of its officers and sailors. Operation Rainbow, designed as a final act of loyalty, had been subverted by the very men who had given their lives to the fleet. By May 6th, the harbors of northern Germany were filled with surrendered vessels. U-boats bobbed quietly in the water, untouched by the explosives meant to destroy them. Allied officers documented each submarine meticulously, cataloging weaponry, codes, and hulls. The Kriegsmarine, once a symbol of terror in the Atlantic, had survived the collapse of the Reich in a manner that preserved both life and legacy. The men themselves faced an uncertain future. Many were held as prisoners of war, yet their actions during the rebellion earned a quiet respect even among their captors. Stories of courage, defiance, and restraint spread quickly. crews who refused to scuttle ships, officers who risked punishment to save lives, and individuals who upheld moral principles in the face of impossible orders. In the month that followed, the surrendered U-boats were studied, repurposed, or decommissioned. Some were taken by the Allies for research, others eventually scrapped. Yet each vessel carried the story of men who had chosen life, conscience, and humanity over blind obedience to a dying regime. Operation Rainbow, though a failure in its original intent, became a testament to moral courage, quiet rebellion, and the enduring value of conscience in war.
The rebellion of the Kriegsmarine in May 1945 remains one of the most remarkable episodes of World War II, a story not of battle or conquest, but of ethical choice, discipline, and the power of human judgment. In the end, the U-boats survived, the crews survived, and history recorded a final, unexpected act of defiance against the inevitable destruction of the Reich. Life aboard the U-boats and the tension of defiance. To understand the rebellion of the Kriegsmarine, one must first understand the men and machines at its heart, the U-boats themselves. These were not merely steel vessels. They were home, battlefield, and tomb for the sailors who lived within them. The Type 7 U-boat, the workhorse of the German fleet, stretched just over 67 meters in length and housed up to 52 men in claustrophobic conditions. Below the deck, every inch was functional: cramped sleeping quarters, tight corridors, engine rooms that rumbled like beasts, and torpedo tubes that demanded precision and respect. Every officer and sailor knew their vessel intimately, its quirks, its temper, and its limits. Captain Heinz Wilhelm Eck often walked the narrow corridors of U-3521, inspecting valves, gauges, and bulkheads, thinking of the scuttling order looming over them. Each crew member knew that following the order would mean opening the seacocks, flooding compartments, and watching the submarine sink to the bottom of Kiel Harbor, a slow, deliberate act of destruction that would erase years of service and sacrifice. Yet defiance was quiet and almost invisible. Some crew members tampered with demolition charges, swapping fuses or misaligning valves so that any attempt at scuttling would fail. Others hid documents and manuals in secret compartments, preserving technological knowledge that the Reich intended to destroy. Each act required careful planning and nerve. Discovery could mean court-martial or worse.
In Wilhelmshaven, aboard U-986, the tension reached near-crisis levels. The crew prepared the vessel for supposed scuttling, filling compartments with water and readying charges. Lieutenant Klaus Richter moved silently through the corridors, signaling to trusted crew members, "Do not engage the charges. We live to surrender, not to die needlessly." Moments later, a senior officer entered to inspect preparations. Heart racing, the crew acted normal, pretending the scuttling procedures were proceeding correctly. The inspection passed, and the rebellion remained undetected. Meanwhile, Captain Friedrich Lang aboard U-987 navigated icy waters in the North Sea. His crew had debated for hours whether to surface and surrender or attempt a perilous journey to another port. Lang's voice carried calm authority. "We will not sink our home. We will surrender, intact, to preserve lives." That decision required both courage and trust. The seas were still dangerous, Allied patrols unpredictable, and any misstep could result in disaster. Yet the crew followed, guided by the captain's moral clarity. The physical mechanics of rebellion were as complex as the moral choices themselves. U-boats were designed to be scuttled quickly. Bulkheads flooded, explosive charges detonated, and holes intentionally breached. But minor sabotage could render these mechanisms useless. Sailors jammed valves, miswired circuits, and sometimes simply refused to initiate the process. In quiet cabins, they recorded logs and charts, documenting every deviation from the official order, a subtle, silent record of defiance. On shore, base officers faced a similar tension. Harbor docks at Kiel and Hamburg were filled with U-boats, each poised for destruction. Officers coordinated surrender plans, ensuring crews and vessels would survive intact.
In some cases, sailors even communicated directly with Allied forces to arrange safe handovers. These clandestine actions required meticulous timing and secrecy because discovery by loyalist officers could trigger severe repercussions. The physical weight of these days cannot be overstated. Sailors who had spent years submerged in darkness, hunted relentlessly by Allied destroyers, now faced the paradox of destroying what they had fought so hard to preserve. Fear mingled with determination, exhaustion mingled with moral clarity. The rebellion was not an act of chaos. It was an act of courage, deliberate and calculated, orchestrated in silence beneath the eyes of a collapsing Reich.
By May 5, 1945, the preparations culminated in coordinated surrender. Each U-boat that had survived the attempted scuttling now floated in harbor, a testament to technical skill, moral courage, and human resilience. Allied officers, initially wary, documented these vessels with a mix of curiosity and admiration, noting the precision and care in which crews had preserved them. The Kriegsmarine's rebellion, executed with discipline and foresight, had succeeded in saving lives and ships alike. Face to face with the Allies. May 5th and 6th, 1945, the final days of Operation Rainbow, brought the Kriegsmarine into direct contact with the Allied forces. What had begun as a quiet rebellion now faced its ultimate test, surrendering to the men who had hunted them relentlessly across the Atlantic, without incident, without resistance. In Kiel, British naval officers navigated the harbor channels cautiously. Smoke still rose from bombed-out factories along the docks, and the scent of salt and oil mixed with the faint acrid smell of destruction. The first U-boat to approach, U-3521, surfaced slowly, its deck crew nervously signaling with white flags. Captain Heinz Wilhelm Eck remained on the bridge, his face calm, but his mind raced with anticipation. As the British destroyers drew closer, tension rippled across the deck. One misstep could be catastrophic. The British, uncertain whether this was a trick or genuine surrender, trained rifles and mounted machine guns on the approaching submarine. Eck raised both hands in a gesture of peace and spoke over the radio. "We surrender. No resistance. All hands safe. U-3521 intact." A tense silence followed. Then slowly, the Allied officers lowered their weapons. A signal boat approached and British sailors boarded, inspecting the submarine carefully. They noted the vessel's condition, fully armed yet meticulously maintained, and curiously, none of the self-destruct mechanisms had been triggered. Ex-crew had succeeded in preserving their ship without incident, a moral and tactical victory.
Meanwhile, at Wilhelmshaven, a similar scene unfolded. U-boats U-986 and U-1023 approached Allied lines, flags of surrender waving. The harbor was crowded with vessels, both German and Allied, the air thick with apprehension. Lieutenant Klaus Richter personally guided his crew through surrender protocols, ensuring that every man and every piece of equipment was accounted for. Allied officers were struck by the calm discipline, noting that the crews had obeyed commands, not the orders of Dönitz, but the dictates of conscience. At Hamburg, surrender negotiations were more delicate. The harbor was heavily mined, and several U-boats were docked in precarious positions. Senior officers coordinated with Allied representatives, carefully maneuvering their vessels to prevent accidents. Captain Erich Mueller of U-1047 recounts later in memoirs. "Every movement felt like walking a tightrope. One wrong signal, and we could have been destroyed by our own mines or by overzealous Allied gunners." Back in Flensburg, Admiral Dönitz observed the surrender unfold through radio updates. Reports came in. One U-boat after another had been handed over intact, crews calm and cooperative. Operation Rainbow, designed to annihilate the fleet before Allied capture, had completely unraveled. Dönitz, a man known for his iron will, faced an unavoidable truth. The Kriegsmarine had chosen moral courage over blind obedience, and nothing he could do would reverse it. Even at sea, encounters with Allied forces were tense. Captain Friedrich Lang of U-987 navigated toward a British destroyer patrol, uncertain whether the vessel would accept surrender peacefully. For hours, the U-boat maintained radio silence, surface lights dimmed, scanning the horizon for threats. When contact was finally made, the British sailors approached cautiously, inspecting the submarine thoroughly before accepting the surrender. Lang later described the moment. "We had survived storms, depth charges, and months of hunting the Atlantic. To surrender intact felt both strange and liberating."
By the evening of May 6th, all major U-boat bases had surrendered. Ships that had been poised for destruction floated silently in the harbors, their crews standing at ease. The rebellion was complete. The Kriegsmarine, once the terror of the Atlantic, had preserved both life and legacy, not by obedience, but by conscience and calculated defiance. The aftermath of these encounters was complex. Some crews were taken to prisoner of war camps. Others remained on their vessels under Allied supervision. Each surrender was carefully documented, and every officer noted the discipline, restraint, and moral courage displayed. The Allied officers, many of whom had spent years hunting these submarines, later remarked on the professionalism and honor of the German crews. Operation Rainbow had failed in its original mission, to scuttle the U-boat fleet. But it succeeded in an unexpected way. It demonstrated that even in the final, darkest hours of a collapsing regime, men could choose life, morality, and reason over destruction and blind loyalty. The quiet rebellion of the Kriegsmarine became a lasting testament to the power of conscience in war, illustrating that courage is not always measured in battle, but often in the choices one makes when orders demand the impossible. Heroes of conscience and the mechanics of defiance. While Operation Rainbow unfolded across northern Germany, it was the quiet courage of individuals that truly shaped its outcome. Each U-boat crew faced the monumental task of resisting orders while maintaining discipline and operational readiness. The rebellion was not violent. It was a test of intellect, nerve, and moral judgment. Captain Heinz Wilhelm Eck of U-3521 had long commanded his crew with precision, demanding respect for the vessel and its men. When the scuttling orders arrived, Eck convened a private meeting with his senior officers. "We have served our fleet and our men," he said quietly, "but the order to destroy our ships is senseless. We will obey reason, not destruction." His words set the tone. Every decision aboard the U-boat would be measured, deliberate, and ethical.
The technical challenges of defying scuttling orders were formidable. U-boats were equipped with scuttling charges designed to flood compartments or destroy hull integrity. Each vessel had seacocks, valves, and explosive charges strategically placed to ensure rapid sinking. Crews had to carefully circumvent these mechanisms without alerting superiors. Sailors like Lieutenant Klaus Richter became experts in subtle sabotage. Valves were subtly jammed or reversed, preventing flooding. Fuses for charges were replaced with inert materials. Critical demolition circuits were rerouted or temporarily disabled. These acts required both knowledge and nerve. A single miscalculation could detonate charges prematurely, killing the crew or destroying the U-boat entirely. Every action was a calculated gamble, a combination of technical skill and moral courage. In Wilhelmshaven, the crew of U-986 faced a tense night. Orders demanded immediate scuttling, but the crew had delayed preparations, claiming mechanical faults. Senior officers inspected the vessel repeatedly, yet every attempt to trigger the charges failed. The men remained silent, sharing tense glances and whispered reassurances. Their rebellion was invisible, yet every gesture carried the weight of life or death. At sea, U-987, under Captain Friedrich Lang, navigated toward Allied destroyers. The crew maintained the vessel's operational readiness while avoiding any action that would trigger self-destruction. The submarine's hull creaked under the cold North Sea pressure. Engines hummed steadily, and torpedo tubes remained armed but untriggered. Every man knew that success meant life, Failure meant annihilation.
Even on shore, the officers faced moral dilemmas. Senior commanders at Hamburg had to balance obedience to Dönitz's orders with the lives of their men. Some risked reprimand by directly communicating with Allied representatives to coordinate surrender. Others secretly monitored scuttling preparations, ensuring that charges were not set off inadvertently. In every case, personal judgment and courage determined the fate of vessels and crews. Once the surrender was complete, the reality of their choices became apparent. Allied officers inspected each U-boat, noting the absence of self-destruction. Many were astonished that the vessels remained fully operational despite orders to scuttle them. Crews were taken to POW camps, yet their morale remained high. Stories circulated of men who had saved lives, preserved technology, and maintained honor in the face of impossible orders. The legacy of these actions endured long after the war. U-boats like U-3521, U-986, and U-987 became subjects of Allied study. Their intact condition provided insight into German naval engineering, torpedo technology, and operational practices. Yet more importantly, they stood as monuments to the human choice to prioritize conscience over blind loyalty, to preserve life in a world bent on destruction. Operation Rainbow, intended as a final act of annihilation, had transformed instead into a story of resilience. The Kriegsmarine's rebellion was not written in headlines or celebrated in parades. It was etched quietly into history by men who chose morality, courage, and careful judgment over obedience to orders that demanded senseless destruction. The aftermath and legacy of Operation Rainbow. By May 7, 1945, the dust had begun to settle over northern Germany's harbors. The Kriegsmarine's rebellion was complete, and the full scope of Operation Rainbow's failure